Welcome back to the Dershow. Before we get back to Trump, another new development about Israel. Not only is the International Criminal Court violating its own rules and its own treaty by claiming to be able to issue warrants against the democratic leader of a democratically elected country, which has a viable judiciary. But now three countries, all of which have histories of anti-Semitism. Ireland, of course, has a long history of anti-Semitism, and of course, wouldn't fight the Nazis during the Second World War, or wouldn't let American boats land in Ireland during the Second World War. They claimed that their support for the Nazis was really just opposition to Germany, to England. But Ireland has had, tragically, a mixed history. It also had, a Jewish mayor of Dublin and others, but it's had a strain of anti-Semitism that runs through it. Norway is probably the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. When I went there to speak on behalf of Israel, brought there, by the way, by a Christian group, protests, threats on my life, you name it. And then Spain. Spain is very simple. If the socialists win, they're anti-Israel. If the conservatives win, they're pro-Israel. Unlike what the United States used to be, where support for Israel was bipartisan, but that seems to be changing now with the Democrats moving away from Israel and the Republicans moving more closely to Israel. Of course, none of this does any good for the Palestinian people. The protests on campuses don't feed a Palestinian, don't help a Palestinian. The International Criminal Court doesn't help any Palestinians. The only country in the Middle East that helps Palestinians, believe it or not, is Israel. Israel has for years educated Palestinians, given health care to Palestinians, given food to Palestinians. They ended the occupation of Gaza in 2005 and wanted to leave Gaza on its own to become Singapore in the Mediterranean. But instead of using their great natural resources, the seashore, etc., to make their people well-educated, well-fed, and happy, it was taken over by Hamas, who used all the money that was poured in to build tunnels and to build rockets. So if you want to do something to help the Palestinians, help them. The best way to help them is to get rid of Hamas, because Hamas has imprisoned them and made it impossible for them to live decent lives. But these countries, the United Nations, Norway, Ireland, and Spain, the International Criminal Court, they're just posturing, just virtue posturing. They do nothing to help the Palestinians at all. They are not going to get the Palestinians a state, and they're not going to feed the Palestinians. Right now, the Palestinians are being fed fine. They're getting lots and lots of trucks coming in from the new port that the United States built, although a lot of the food now is being stolen by Hamas. And taken to their soldiers rather than given to the ordinary civilians. Remember, too, Hamas refused to build any shelters for civilians because they want civilians to die. Israel has spent hundreds of millions of dollars been building shelters to protect its citizens. So it's so simple. Hamas wants both Israeli and Palestinian civilians to die, and Israel wants both Palestinian and Israeli civilians to live. Just today, there was a report of Israel caught by remote. They saw one of the men who had been responsible for October 7th. They got him. It was clear. And he was there with two other terrorists. And they were about to send a rocket to kill him. But they saw a child nearby. And they did not send the rocket. They could have failed to kill these three terrorists. But they waited until the child moved far away. And then they did attack and kill the three terrorists. Is that genocide? If it's genocide, you want to kill the children. If you're just acting in self-defense, then you even take risks of not being able to kill Hamas terrorists, including people who've killed your own people, to help save a single child. That's the difference between Hamas and Israel, a difference that the International Criminal Court doesn't seem to recognize, in addition to Israel being a democracy, which has prosecuted 4 or 5 of its own prime ministers and presidents, whereas Hamas would never dare prosecute anybody except gays and feminists and anybody who didn't agree with their extraordinarily reactionary politics. So those are big differences. All right, turn to Trump now. Yesterday, and now maybe the most important parts of the Trump trial. This is going to be surprising to you, but I'm an appellate lawyer. I've done, I don't know, 250 appeals, probably more than any criminal private appellate lawyer, maybe in the history of the country. I've done more criminal appeals probably than anybody. And I know something about that, and I've taught about it for years. And many of the appeals, perhaps most, I haven't actually done a count, most or many of the appeals that I've won based on the instructions, because the instructions is what tells the jury what the law is. And if the judge gets it wrong on the instructions, and judges often do, that requires a reversal of the conviction if the failed instruction was prejudicial to the defendant. And that's why both sides spent so much time yesterday in court trying to work out the instructions. Now, one thing is clear to me: the instructions will not be fair. I can already tell from just the inkling of material I've heard from the courthouse yesterday. I was not there yesterday. I was there the day before yesterday, and I saw with my own eyes the bias that and the hatred that it seems to me that Judge Marchant has toward Donald Trump and everybody on his side. But the instructions, how do you instruct in a case where even lawyers and even law professors don't understand the charges? I'll try to simplify it. According to the prosecution's theory, in order to convict Trump, you have to prove all of the following things. And I'll lay out what the evidentiary requirements are and the burdens. So you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, A, that the entry made in the corporate forms calling payments a retainer or legal expenses instead of reimbursement for a non-disclosure agreement, that the entry, the very entry of that statement was fraudulent. That's the first, and they have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I don't think it was fraudulent. He didn't say, first of all, before we get to who said it, but in itself, it wasn't fraudulent. It didn't say it was construction costs. It didn't say it was something that was so clearly deductible. It didn't say anything like that. It just said, retainer, legal expenses, instead of being very specific and saying legal expenses for avoiding a trial and avoiding the embarrassment of a disclosure of alleged sexual encounter with a porn star. So the first question is, was that fraudulent at all? I don't think it was fraudulent. Usually for it to be fraudulent, it has to be very deceptive. And if it had been construction costs, maybe it would have been fraudulent. But saying legal expenses and legal retainer instead of legal payments, reimbursement to avoid a lawsuit and to avoid embarrassment and to avoid losing his contract with the television network and to help him in his presidential campaign, that I don't think was fraudulent. So number one, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the entry was fraudulent. Second, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump himself, the defendant, knew about and ordered that entry be made. I don't think know about is enough. He had to have said to somebody, make that entry. Don't say it was reimbursement for a payment of a non-disclosure. Don't say that. Say instead something that's false, namely that it was a retainer or that it was legal expenses. I don't think there was any evidence of that at all. But the government has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt as well. Okay, let's assume it can prove both of those things. It's a misdemeanor, and it's barred by the statute of limitations. Those alleged crimes occurred years and years ago. So that's not enough to warrant a conviction. The judge has to instruct the jury, if that's all you find, if all you find is that the entry of the record was fraudulent and that Donald Trump instructed the entry to be made, you must acquit because it wasn't within the statute of limitations. Now, in order to bring it outside the statute of limitations, you have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt here that the purpose, the intention, the reason why Donald Trump, who didn't make the entry, but why he ordered the false entry, it wasn't false, but you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the reason Donald Trump made the false entry was to hide another crime, commit another crime, cover up another crime, be an accessory to another crime. Okay, that you have to find. Then the question is which crime? We still don't know for sure. But some of the things that were thrown out were New York State tax evasion, though I don't think there's any evidence that Donald Trump actually took these legal expenses or the payment of a non-disclosure as a tax deduction. By the way, I think paying to avoid a lawsuit may very well be tax deductible, but I don't think there's any evidence that the deduction was taken. So the crime is intending to have filed a false return in the future, because the return wouldn't be filed until years later. You know how tax returns are filed by big corporations, usually 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. And I don't even know if the tax returns have been filed to this date, but there's no evidence that they claimed tax deductions. Or you have to prove, and this is the one that is so outrageous, that the intent was to defraud the voters of New York. The theory is the voters of New York all thought that Donald Trump was a virgin, or that he had sex only with somebody he was married to, and that he never deviated from monogamy. And if they learned that he had sex with a porn star, they would have changed their vote. Is there anybody in New York who didn't know that Donald Trump was a player, that Donald Trump bragged? Everybody had heard it in the Access Hollywood tape. I can touch a woman's genitals and they don't object. I can kiss them. I can do anything I want because I'm famous. I'm a celebrity. So it's inconceivable that anybody could have been defrauded. And it's inconceivable that Donald Trump, if he did order that fraudulent statement to be made in his corporate forms, did it to defraud the voters of New York. First of all, the voters of New York were going to vote against Donald. There's no way. New York wasn't in play. New York, he didn't care about it. Did he spend 1 minute campaigning in New York back in 2016? If he did, he was a fool, because New York went overwhelmingly for Biden in 2016, as it did in 2020. So there's no way he could have defrauded the voters of New York. Did he defraud the country? Well, that's a federal issue where there's no jurisdiction in the state court. The judge will also instruct the jury that the secondary crime, the one that brings it within the statute of limitations and elevates it from a misdemeanor to a felony, does not have to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. You can just prove that by a preponderance of the evidence, which means 50.1% to 49.9%. So just if it's slightly more likely than not that he intended to evade taxes or intended to defraud the people of New York, you can find that even though you don't believe it's true beyond a reasonable doubt. And then, how would we know what the jury decided in the end? Let's assume the jury comes back with a guilty verdict. In New York, generally, the verdict is either guilty or not guilty. In the federal courts, sometimes there is a piece of paper that makes you check off boxes. Which crime did you think he committed? This, that, the other thing. That's generally not the case in New York. Maybe they'll do it in this case, but I doubt it. So you don't know which crime they were convicted of, so it's almost impossible to appeal that. You'd have to demonstrate that each of the alleged crimes, some of which we still don't really know what they are, there was no sufficient evidence to prove it. That's interesting because in the appellate division in New York, unlike the appeals court in almost any other state, and unlike federal appeals courts, you can challenge not only the sufficiency of the evidence, is there enough evidence, you can challenge the quality of the evidence. If the appellate division thinks, for example, that Michael Cohen was lying, that it seems more likely than not that he was lying, they can throw out the conviction. Because remember, the only evidence that Donald Trump knew that the hush money was paid came from this 90-something second phone call, which has now been acknowledged was mostly about this 14-year-old kid who was calling him at night, we don't even know whether it's true. It doesn't seem likely that it's true, that within the 90 seconds, probably 70 of which were taken up with this call about the kid and giving numbers and, finding out who to call and what to do. Maybe 20 seconds could have been devoted to telling him about so many things. What would he tell him? Trump talks a lot. If you ever talk to Trump, and I was with him on Monday eating John's Pizza, he never stops talking. And he dominates the conversation. I'm sure that's as true on the phone as it is in person. I know it's as true on the phone because he called me on the phone. I remember one day I was in Chilmark in the belly of the radical progressive beast, and I was sitting on the Chilmark store porch having a slice of pizza, and the phone rings. Hey, Alan, it's Donald. Temptation is always Donald, too. He was president at the time. I said, oh, Mr. President, what do you want? He said, I want to know who you think I should appoint to the Supreme Court. And, I was ready, and he hardly let me talk. He said, well, let me tell you who I'm really. Oh, I did say, by the way, when he said, who should I appoint to the Supreme Court? I said Merrick Garland, because Merrick Garland had just been appointed to the Supreme Court by Barack Obama, but they never gave him a hearing, so it was a joke. And Trump said, oh, that's very funny. Now let's get serious. It's between, and then he mentioned the four people, two of whom are now on the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh and Barrett. And I gave him my suggestion, Kavanaugh, at that point, because I knew more about him than I did about any of the other three. But he dominated the conversation. He spent most of the time talking, and that's the way Trump does things. So the fact that Cohen claims that he gave him a full accounting of the money that was paid, how the money was paid, and all of that in the few seconds that were remaining on a 90-second call seems to defy credibility. But it seems from what I've read so far, and again, I can't believe anything anymore that I read about the trial. I certainly don't believe it if it's NBC, because they made up a whole story about me completely from top to bottom, involving my discussion with my old friend Norm Eisen in the courtroom. They've since corrected the record on that. I certainly don't believe MSNBC. I certainly don't believe CNN. What they say happened in the courtroom. MSNBC thinks this is the strongest case since the Lincoln assassination, if the Lincoln assassination had been on videotape. So, if it's not legit, you must acquit. That's not going to be argued. That was argued by my friend Johnny Cochran in the O.J. Simpson case. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. The judge would, of course, exclude that in this case. But, it's true. This is not a legitimate case. If it's not legit, you should acquit. You shouldn't have brought the case in the first place. But I don't think that's going to happen. The judge will instruct the jury. There's now a week before the jury will deliberate. They will have forgotten probably some of the highlights of the cross-examination of Michael Cohen and some of the testimony of Michael Cohen's lawyer, Bob Costello. And of course, they weren't in the courtroom when the judge went berserk and did, a taxi driver on Bob. He looked at him the way, remember in Taxi Driver, that great movie? You looking at me? You looking at me? Yeah, and that's what the judge was basically saying. I'm a judge. You can't look at me. You have to turn your face the way, when in the Jewish religion, when you ask for God's blessings, if you're a high priest, you can't look. You have to put the talit over your eyes to avoid looking. And basically, that's what the judge was saying to Costello. Don't look at me and don't raise your eyebrows. Just look straight ahead as if you're a third grade school child with your hands folded and answer the questions directly. But don't look at me. Don't stare me down. Don't raise your eyebrows. Well, I have to tell you, I raised my eyebrows plenty in that courtroom, but he has no control over me. I'm not a witness. I'm just an ordinary visitor. I'm shocked that he didn't throw me out of the courtroom when he threw everybody else out of the courtroom. I have no idea whether he knew, whether he recognized me or saw me. I was sitting right in the front row. I mean, hard to miss. But I was not asked to leave, and I certainly wasn't going to volunteer to leave. I wanted to be a witness to what was going on. I had no idea that I would see something as outrageous as what the judge did in this case, threatening to strike the defendant's testimony because he didn't like the way a defense witness who has nothing to do with Trump. I don't know if Trump has ever even met Costello, but because he didn't like the way Costello looked, he was going to strike Costello's testimony to the disadvantage that that happened. If that had happened, it would be an automatic reversal. But he didn't eventually. He was bluffing. But he intimidated. He intimidated Costello, and that's wrong too. And what the judge did when the press was out of that courtroom, as I've said before, that's recorded. There is a recording of that. There is a television camera in the courtroom. There are several of them. So nobody can claim that we don't record trials because it's too cumbersome. The TV in the courtroom, and it's shown to the overflow room. And it's also shown to those of us who are in the room, because sometimes you can't see a witness or you can't see the lawyers, and the camera's in the front so you can see the lawyer's face as he's arguing to the judge. So it's there. It's just they're denying the public the right to see it, but it's there. And someday, I want that video to be made public. I want the public to see the way this judge, who is a benevolent despot when the media is in the room and when the jury is in the room, but his true colors show when he throws everybody out of the room. I want the public to see what he was really like during that period of time. So we'll see. But, in life, things don't really ever go away, disappear. There is a recording, and that recording will, I think, someday come back to haunt. For example, if he's ever promoted, I would think that the people who have to confirm him would have the right to see it. Maybe the video could be used on appeal. I don't know what the law of New York is, whether you can use the video of a trial on appeal if it's essential to make a point. For example, if there were an issue about the demeanor of a witness, well, there is an issue about the demeanor of a witness. Could you then raise that on appeal? I don't know. Well, next week we'll be back and we'll be talking about the Trump case more because on Tuesday we go back to court. There'll be closing arguments. It'll be interesting what the closing arguments will be like. I wait to hear them. I won't hear them, but I wait to hear what MSNBC says. Of course, I know what they're going to say. I could be the broker. Well, the prosecution made a compelling and convincing, powerful case for a conviction, while the defense attorneys were just floundering around and didn't have a straight narrative or a compelling case. You know that's what MSNBC is going to say, no matter what. They don't have to even hear it. That's what they're going to say. And CNN will probably just parrot it. Okay, let's look at some questions. The judge did not have the authority to clear the courtroom. The Constitution requires public trials. Absolutely right. The other night I had a dream. I dreamt I'm sitting in the front row. That's actually happened. And the judge says to me, "Hey, Professor Dershowitz, out of the courtroom." And I get up and say, "No, Your Honor, I'm a member of the public, and here's my copy of the Constitution. Look at the Sixth Amendment. It says defendants have a right to a public trial. I'm a member of the public. I'm not leaving. I'm going to get a court order from a higher court to allow me to stay in this court to be a representative of the public. You can't make me leave." Well, probably would have thrown me in the pokey, but that was my dream. I didn't do that because he didn't throw me out. But that was interesting. Thank you, Mr. Dershowitz, for being not a Democrat or a Republican, but just an American. I guess that's high praise. I am not today a Republican or a Democrat. I could not today vote for Joseph Biden. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pull the lever for somebody who supports diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI bureaucracy. He went to Morehouse College and he doubled down on how important DEI is. DEI is the worst thing that's ever happened to American universities, one of the worst things that's ever happened to America. It's the new form of McCarthyism. And, teachers have to now take oaths They have to issue statements in support of DEI. Part of me wishes I was back at Harvard. I wouldn't sign such a statement. I wouldn't ever, ever, ever commit myself to any kind of orthodoxy. And that's what DEI does. And I can't support a president who supports DEI. I can't support a president who has said some of the things he said about Israel and about American democracy. So right now, I have an open mind. I don't know who I'm going to vote for. President Trump said any Jew like Alan Dershowitz, he used my name, who is still a Democrat, has to have his head examined. But if my head was examined, you would find an open mind. I haven't made a decision. I know I get letters all the time. How can you not be a Republican? Well, easy. When you hear Republicans now talking about, well, maybe contraception is kind of part of the right to life. Maybe we should limit contraception to, look, if this were England and it was the Conservative Party, it'd be easy. I'd be a conservative, because conservatives in England don't go into people's beds, into people's bedrooms, into their private lives. And the Conservative Party in England is a libertarian party, whereas the Republican Party is not a libertarian party. It is too much in favor of intrusion. It has libertarian elements. Oh, Second Amendment, they're libertarian about the Second Amendment, but they're not libertarian when it comes to the right to die. They're not libertarian when it comes to the right to practice certain forms of birth control, which are effectively abortion the day after pills. So, it's a conflict. It's a conflict. And for people for whom it's not a conflict, it's easy. But for people who favor one party on some issues and the other party on other issues, it's a difficult conflict. So I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. This is a nice letter. This is to Elon's son. This is to Alan's son, Elon. Enjoy him. He's a gift. And I'm a full-blown conservative, but your pops is a gift. He's funny as hell, and as he gets older, he gets funnier. Well, maybe funnier looking. But I appreciate that. And I know my son appreciates me as I appreciate him. If the prosecutors knew that Cohn was lying, aren't they guilty of suborning perjury, a felony? It's a very interesting question. If they knew he lied in the past and they front that to the jury, of course not. If they ask him a question and he gives an answer that they know is false and they don't correct that answer, they have committed an ethical violation, but they have to know it's false. Now, they don't have to know it to a certainty. And I think there probably was a point when they asked him, would you profit from a conviction? And he said no. Everybody in that courtroom, every rational human being knows he was lying. And I think the prosecution should have corrected that. As an American, we should have the right to hear that trial. We shouldn't have the right to hear what the leading Republican candidate has to say. We should have had the right to judge the judge and his biases. This will happen again, except to ordinary Americans. Corrupt courts will strip us of our First and Sixth Amendments. I agree with you. And that's why it's so important to have trials televised. Not only important and high profile trials like this one, but every trial, there should be the right to have it televised. Let the public see how its system is working. And here's a typical kind of anti-letter. Yada, yada, yada about Israel. Move on, Dersh. We know you irrationally believe in a funny man who lives in the firmament. What is this guy talking about? That I believe in God? That's my business. I struggle with my beliefs about theology. None of your business. But I do support Israel. Yada, 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 yada. Okay, last question. Professor Joe Biden condemned the ICC and their arrest warrants for Israeli leaders. Thank you for that. That was the right thing to do, and I praise Biden for doing that. Yet, on the other hand, he praised Congresswoman and Israel hater Pramila Jayapal as a woman with more courage and chutzpah stamina than anyone I know. How much longer can this president be on both sides of the fence? Of course. He praised AOC, who is virulently anti-Israel, said, I've learned to listen to that lady. The former Speaker of the House took a picture with the biggest anti-Semite in the House of Representatives. So I agree with you. I think the Democrats are trying to be on both sides of that issue, and they can't be. They should be on the right side, the just side. They should be against anti-Semitism, and against those members of Congress that espouse anti-Semitism, and against those members of Congress that are bigoted against the nation state of the Jewish people. And I cannot vote for a party that does not marginalize people who have those views. And I think the Republicans have done a better job of marginalizing the few bigots on their right than the Democrats have in marginalizing the greater number of bigots on their hard left, including Jews. Look, the senator from Vermont, Sanders, is a bigot. He is a bigot. He's an anti-Semite. He's Jewish, yes, but he's a self-hating Jewish bigot, and nobody should support him. He supports the International Criminal Courts singling out of Israel. They haven't even gone after Syria for murdering hundreds of thousands of people. They didn't go after Iran for sending hundreds of rockets to murder Israelis, but they go after the prime minister of Israel, who is duly elected in a country with a very independent and great judiciary. Sanders, you should be ashamed of yourself. Okay, see you next week.